On today's World Insight, international cooperation in the Arctic in limbo as the United States and its allies keep Russia in the cold. What are the dangers of an unbridled race for polar power?
Whatever change in the Arctic region will have enormous impact on our life because we live in the same village.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has destabilized the Arctic order, some say. The race is on among countries surrounding the Arctic to assert claims in the area and the vital resources beneath the ocean surface. Some believe that is the core issue we are facing today. Is it true? The Arctic has seen some militarizing efforts for years, with U.S. and Russia trying to establish their own control over the area. The U.S. has stepped up its strategic patrols in the Arctic region and strengthened its alliance with Denmark, Norway, Canada, and other countries in an attempt to contain Russia in the Arctic region. Amid the Russia-Ukraine conflict, things are getting ever more complicated in the Arctic region. What is at stake? Let's loop in our panelists. For more on the region of the Arctic, in Helsinki, we have Dr. Sanna Kaupra, Senior Researcher at the Northern Institute for Environmental and Minority Law at Arctic Center of the University of Lapland. In London, Dr. Jamie Shea, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. In Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, a Russian political and defense analyst. In Beijing, Huang Jing, Dean of the Institute for International and Regional Studies with Beijing Language and Culture University. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. This is a very strong panel. I hope we could go a little bit more in depth about what is going on. Now, the forum, which is being held every year, has been cancelled with the protest of the 7 out of 8 members of the Arctic Council. But the issues remain. Dr. Kaupra, tell me more about what are some of the most urgent issues in your mind?
Well, climate change is, of course, the most important issue when it comes to the Arctic, and it's still the most important security risk in the Arctic as well. So there is no real risk of military conflict in the Arctic at the moment. But the fragile environment is very important issue, and the protection of environment has to be continued even if there are some geopolitical tensions.
Is it going to be a sea change as a result of the Russian-Ukraine conflict that is going on right now for the Arctic Council? Dr. Shea.
Well, yes, I think there will be a sea change, unfortunately, because I think over the last few years, the Western countries have performed a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, reinforcing their military presence and visibility in the region, because Russia, as everybody knows, has been rebuilding some of its old Soviet-era military bases up in the high north. And, for example, NATO has just recently had a major exercise in Norway called a Cold Response. But on the other hand, preserving the fact that even during the tensions of the Cold War, the High North was a relatively quiet region where Russia, the Soviet Union, and the other states cooperated on those environmental issues, on fisheries, on dealing with incidents.
Mr. Felgenhauer, from Russia's perspective, how do you see the core issues that the Arctic Council is facing?
For Russia, this is the Arctic today seems much more important than ever during the Soviet period or the Cold War. Then it was seen as a possible battlefield where American bombers would be moving in, missiles would be moving in from the north over the pole, attacking targets deep inside Russia. And Soviet Union was building bases, mostly air bases, to station interceptors. Now it's very different. Not only are those old bases air bases have been back into circulation. Russia is building new bases in places it never had in Soviet time, and not only air bases, but also placing anti-ship missiles, anti-aircraft missiles deep inside the Arctic, actually preparing for possible air-sea encounters there. Russia believes, there is a strong belief in Russia that the Arctic contains enormous amounts of natural gas and oil, and that Russia should claim them, and that the West may actually claim it too, and that the ice is going to melt. The Arctic will become a transit for a lot of trade from the Asia-Pacific region to Europe and the Atlantic, and that Russia should have capabilities to prevent other nations claiming what Russia believes is its own. And actually, Russia has already announced that any ship that tries to traverse the Sevmorputs or the northeast passage from the Pacific to the Atlantic without Russian consent is going to be challenged.
Dr. Kopra, you see, these two gentlemen seem to say the priorities have changed. It's all about security now. Now, what does that leave to you, who has been focusing on climate change and environmental issues?
Yes, that is very unfortunate. It seems that this talk about militarization and tensions, geopolitical tension in the Arctic started already before the war in Ukraine, so it's not a new thing, but it has been started like a couple of years ago already because of the power transition and the overall power politics at a global stage. Still, climate change is the most important issue, and if states focus on building their military capabilities, they are not likely to improve their measures against climate change. The focus will be in hard security issues, and then the needs and rights of local people, especially indigenous peoples, will be dismissed, and this is very unfortunate. And even, I mean, just last week we saw the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which the message is very clear that we have to take very, very hurried measures to tackle climate change. Otherwise, we can't prevent the dangerous climate change from happening. And in the Arctic, climate change proceeds very fast.
So there is a competition about priorities. Certainly, I can see through our conversation even today. Dr. Huang, I mean, you are in China. Of course, China is not an Arctic state, but China claims itself to be a near Arctic country. And China certainly has its own observations, both about the conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine, and at the same time, what is the peaceful way of using the Arctic region and growing of the Arctic region. So Dr. Huang, how do you see this debate about priorities?
Whatever change in the Arctic region will have enormous impact on our life because we live in the same village. That's why the situation is quite worrisome for three reasons. Reason number one, of course, we see a kind of tendency of militarization of the region. Either the Americans or Russians and some other countries try to reinforce or build a new military base over there for geopolitical reasons. That is very worrisome. Second, the recent Russia-Ukraine conflict or war has kind of politicized further this relationship in that region. In other words, politics will hijack our management of Arctic affairs, because we know before the two countries, at least Sweden and Finland, seems to be a neutral position. But now the situation in Ukraine, we know that those two countries will join the NATO, which will make it very difficult to manage affairs over there, because whatever we do, we cannot wipe out Russia, and Russia still is the largest country in terms of territory in that region. So now this polarization in that Arctic management is a damage. Last, this kind of all way out, all in sanctions against Russia for whatever reason will further damage our effort to use green energy to slow down the kind of changes, just like the lady just said in Arctic. But now we see that because of this sanction against Russia, some major countries in Europe, like Germany, will have to postpone their plan to promote green energies utilization. They're going to use more coal, for example, to make sure that the energy shortage will be handled in a way that people's life will not dramatically deteriorated. All of this, I see a kind of I'm not very optimistic for future for whatever reason. And so I think that we have to try to isolate the Arctic affairs management from the geopolitics. We do not want politics become the major show in that region.
Dr. Shea, I know you have been doing security issues throughout your life, and particularly when you were serving at the NATO. Now, how do you see the Arctic issue evolving over the past few years, leading up to the Russia-Ukraine crisis? Did you read signs of crisis during those period of time?
My sense is that the Arctic has become a region of greater strategic significance, but not simply because of Russia's military activities in the high north, also, as was said, because the region, with the melting of the polar ice pack at a very rapid rate, has opened up now to international navigation. We've had the first ships that have been able to transit through the so-called Northeast Passage all the way from China into the Northern Atlantic, but also the fact, as was said, that this is a region which has about 25% of the world's natural gas resources and about 15% of the oil. Of course, with the prices of those commodities going up, it becomes more attractive for companies to go back to exploration and drilling. There's also, of course, with greater human activity, the environmental impact, and of course, the need for some kind of international supervision and regulation. So there are many factors that are feeding into this. And indeed, the Arctic Council has been a good forum for cooperation and for trying to keep, as was said, geopolitics out of the equation and to have good cooperation among the different states. I do believe that, notwithstanding Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the other Arctic states are not going to stop meeting and cooperating on these issues among themselves, because Russia, of course, is not the only player, even if it's a significant one. I would also hope that cooperation between Western countries and China on these issues can continue. But on the other hand, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a very major event, and we can't simply sort of wish it out of existence because it's inconvenient to other aspects of the agenda. The sanctions have been applied not just by NATO countries, but a large number of other countries around the world, and that's going to be a factor, just like it's Russian pressure on Ukraine, which is pushing Sweden and Finland closer to NATO, although I don't really believe that the membership of Finland and Sweden in NATO would change in any way the current sort of need for that kind of management of the Arctic resources.
That's why I want to also talk to Dr. Kopra, even though, ma'am, your focus is more on the climate change and environmental issues, which are crucial for every one of us, particularly when it comes to the Arctic Circle. But, how do you see these geopolitical changes? You're based in Lapland, you're from Finland, even Finland is now thinking and working on joining the NATO. What would that mean for the overall approaches your country and you yourself as a researcher might have to do during the future discussions about the Arctic?
Finland is planning to apply for NATO membership, and this has been a very dramatic change in Finland's foreign policy, because before the war in Ukraine started, there was hardly no public discussion about NATO membership, and the government had already decided that they won't apply membership. But this war in Ukraine changed very dramatically Finland's position. But when it comes to the Arctic, I don't think it will change Finland's or Sweden's NATO membership will change Arctic politics anyhow, because Well, first of all, Finland's membership in NATO doesn't have anything to do with its position or location in the Arctic, but because of its neighbor of Russia. So it's not because of Arctic politics, but it's because of our geopolitical location. And Russia has always been the biggest security threat to Finland's sovereignty. And even before the Arctic region came into kind of being a region in 1990s. So it's not a new thing for Finland. And when it comes to Finland's or Sweden's Arctic policy, climate change is definitely going to be the key issue for these governments. And because the Arctic Council doesn't focus on military issues, NATO membership doesn't really affect those discussions. And even before, most of the members of Arctic Council have been NATO membership. So I don't think that is an issue when it comes to cooperation in Arctic Council.
Your point is taken. And this is World Insight. We're going to continue our discussion, ladies and gentlemen, right after this break. The issues of the Arctic. Let's continue our discussion with World Insight. Now with me, once again, Sanna Kaupra, Jamie Shea, Pavel Felgenhauer, and Huang Jing. The Arctic Council have been working on many joint initiatives. For example, it has been putting out agreements talking about the fisheries, resource management, conservation, pollution, climate change, and in addition to the 8 members, it also includes 6 permanent participants representing Arctic indigenous communities. It has also been talking about building agreements on the search and rescue efforts, the oil pollution responsibilities, and scientific research activities in the Arctic. All these lists are very important and takes years of efforts to reach where it is today. Now, Mr. Felgenhauer, how do you expect those discussions, which are equally important, shall I say, to geopolitics that are being discussed at the Arctic Council, can we expect them to continue?
Well, I would want to add some optimism to a rather gloomy picture. The fact is that the ice in the Arctic is melting not as fast as some thought. It's still impossible to traverse the Sèvres-Morpouch from the Pacific to the Atlantic, surely without the help of Russian icebreakers, and Russia has the biggest icebreaker fleet in the world, which means that this waterway did not become a world waterway. And second, that means that the United States Navy, that was talking actually about performing a freedom of navigation, so-called operations in the Arctic, like in the South China Sea, is not doing it because American naval ships are not really well designed for the Arctic, where the freezing conditions. And actually they believe that, okay, we go there, and then we get stuck in the ice, and then we ask the Russians, yes, to save us out. So that means that right now the confrontation is still very potential. It's still very much frozen because Russian kind of claims for the Sèvres-Morpouch, well, de facto, they're controlled by the ice there. And so the polar bears still have some advantage over the military from all sides. That means this potential conflict is going to be dormant for the time being. And I believe that the conflict in Ukraine actually is also some good news for the Arctic, because with engagement there, engagement at the same time in the Arctic is maybe less possible. And in the Arctic, actually, the main threat was that it would be a direct confrontation, Russia-America military. And that's most likely not happening. And that means when the Ukrainian issue is going to be resolved somehow, the cooperation in the Arctic Council will resume also on issues of really a joint interest like the environment and the change in climate and so on.
What NATO has been doing has been simply increasing its ability to reinforce the region if necessary. But what is interesting is that Norway, one of the founding NATO members, hasn't changed its traditional posture of not wanting permanent military infrastructure, NATO infrastructure and NATO bases on its territory in peacetime. What NATO has been doing is just simply exercising its ability to rotate forces in and out of Norway as the situation may require. The US has had a couple of marine detachments up in Norway doing this for a couple of years already, since Russia annexed Crimea back in 2016, and the UK just a couple of days ago announced that it would also be sending a marine task force regularly to Norway and also to Finland and Sweden, even if they do not join NATO. So NATO's posture has been to increase its situational awareness in the region, its ability to operate in the region. The US, the UK have been up with ships in the Sea of Barents, for example, its ability to exercise. But yes, Pavel is correct. We don't see in the High North a radical transformation in military posture, such as what NATO is currently thinking of doing in the Baltic region or in Poland, the Baltic states, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm not so optimistic maybe as Pavel that cooperation with Russia is going to resume anytime soon. We look as if we're set for a prolonged conflict now in Ukraine. I personally don't see any political settlement, certainly not one which would be acceptable to the Ukrainians emerging anytime soon. I think that many of the sanctions on Russia are going to stay, and therefore I think that one of the challenges is going to be to keep up this sort of cooperation on Arctic environmental matters, fisheries, conservation, responsible exploitation of energy resources going for some time, with Russia less involved in that than was the case before. And the other thing I didn't mention, but which is important, that of course as the West tries to diversify also its access to rare earths, to precious minerals, very important, particularly if you're going to switch to electric cars and decarbonisation. A country like Greenland, which potentially has quite large resources of those rare earths, becomes potentially much more interesting. We're likely to see more mining activities for these precious metals in the region. And that, of course, on the one hand, can reduce the West's dependency on Russia or China. China produces about 90% of those rare earths at the moment. But of course, mining will also pose some environmental challenges as well. It could also bring more people to live in the region as well, vis-a-vis the Indian populations who have been there. And that, again, I think is going to pose some development and social questions too.
Before we go, I do want to have your final opinions about one issue. How do you see the eligibility of the Atlantic Council to do its job? And how do you see the function of the process of discussions and negotiations used earlier by the Council among its members and the so-called near Arctic countries at the point of dramatic change in the world? Now, let me go to Dr. Huang first.
I think Arctic Council has done a good job. We all owe them a big thanks, appreciation. That's why it's very worrisome now. The good job they have done in the past could be deeply undermined by this event, this conflict happening in Ukraine. That's what worries all of us, because it will highly politicize the management of it.
Dr. Shea, 1 or 2 sentences, please.
First sentence, NATO, is a defensive alliance, but it has a number of states in the Arctic region that it has a responsibility to defend. But before Russia's actions, NATO had a very low profile in the region. So I don't think the problem has been caused in any way by NATO. First sentence. Second sentence, Russia also is suffering in a major way from climate change. Look at all of the major forest fires in Siberia over the last few years. So Russia also has an interest in being a good partner here and in cooperating. And I hope that sooner or later, Moscow will wake up to that reality. But it takes two to tango, and we can't just have one side wanting cooperation and the other side refusing it.
All right, 2 sentences, if you can, Mr. Falkenhauer.
The de facto breakdown of the Arctic Council work that's happening right now because of the overall confrontation between the West and Russia is very, very bad for the Arctic. And I hope that it will be reversed. The sooner the better. We should hope for that to happen.
All right. Last but certainly not least, Dr. Kopra.
Well, as I said in the beginning, climate change is the most important security risk in the Arctic. So the work of the Arctic Council is super, super important in that sense when it comes to the mitigation of adaptation to climate change. And military alliances don't focus on climate change, and they just take attention from these important issues when it comes to environment.
Dr. Sanna Kopra, Dr. Jamie Shea, Mr. Pavel Felgenhauer, Dr. Huang Jing. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. We are trying to present different voices in this discussion. We're not trying to reach any conclusion, and things are changing very fast as we speak. Thank you so much for joining us, all of you. Appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.